Hello and welcome to the first Foxpunter Manager Profiling of 2021. Happy New Year to you. Thanks very much for sticking with us or for giving us a listen for the very first time. Hopefully you enjoy what you hear over the next 45 minutes. And if you do, we'd very much appreciate if you could like and subscribe our podcast and perhaps even write us a review. Being a football manager, as you know, is one of the most precarious jobs in the game, and tenures tend to be fairly short. Despite this, today we're focusing on two gaffers who have enjoyed fairly lengthy spells at their current clubs. However, at this current time of recording, both find themselves under a little bit of pressure. We're aiming to carry on where we left off in 2020. So once again, we'll be psychologically profiling these two household names with the help of Foxpunter's Mike Holden. Mike, Happy New Year to you.
Yeah, Happy New Year, Jack, and all the best to the listeners as well. Happy 2021.
Yeah, hoping for lots of excitement over the next few weeks because we've got a lot of games to catch up on. But while we've been away, Mike, only a couple of weeks, there's been plenty of action in the dugout. So we're going to start by just running through a couple of the major moves. First of all, Tony Pulis wasn't there for long at Hillsborough, was he?
No, and yeah, the writing was on the wall relatively early, I think, in the sense that he basically came into the job as if he was going to be the saviour, that he knew exactly what he was doing. This air of conviction about him, replacing Gary Monk. I wasn't sure that he was going to be a massive upgrade on Monk. I didn't see really what was changing in terms of the football. But then quickly, Pulis, within a few weeks, started to, basically wasn't happy with what he inherited and that he was already kind of in the mode of coasting till January. So he was waiting for the January transfer window. He didn't display much faith in the players. So then you're thinking, well, there's a hell of a lot of games got to be played before he gets to bring in his own signings. And it kind of just went from bad to worse. And I think possibly Pulis took one look around the place. He got in and thought, I don't fancy this compared to other jobs I've done. And he made it no secret of the fact. So things kind of just blew out of proportion pretty quickly. He just never really got a handle on the job at any stage.
No, so he is gone. At this time of recording, they haven't yet found a replacement. I don't know how many people will be up for working with Chancery, given what has happened over the past few years. And many people now reflecting and saying, oh, well, maybe Gary Monk wasn't doing that bad a job.
Yeah, well, totally. That was kind of my thoughts in the beginning, is that, there was nothing perfect about what Monk was doing. The job, he just had a handle on it. And he had a track record that suggested, relative to what Tony Pulis did at Middlesbrough, that he could churn out points at a rate of higher mid-table, just outside the playoffs kind of standard, and over 46 games with a 12-point deduction, which later became 6. That he would have enough to get them out at a 12-point deduction given the time and opportunity, but he wasn't given that time and opportunity. And I think Chancery's just meddling now. I just think he doesn't know what he's doing himself, and he's going from one crisis to the next and cost it. I mean, I don't know what Pulis's compensation figure's like, but I suggest, given that Pulis's demeanour towards the end, he was quite happy for the ties to be cut the way they were and for him to just take his payout and move on. So it's another bad mistake from Chancery in the way that he's running the club. And, the club has got financial problems as it is. So things aren't getting any better.
No, I think it wasn't a massive surprise when Tony Pulis left, given the comments that he'd made. And it definitely wasn't a surprise, Mike, when John Askey departed Port Vale in League Two, because they'd been on a wretched run of form prior to his dismissal.
Yeah, it's a real shame, this one, for me, in the sense that I believe that last season it was a nice story what happened at Port Vale after Norman Smurthwaite finally left. The new owners coming in, the Shanahans, and, it was a real family club feel again about the place, good intentions about everything that we're doing. And John Askey seemed like a manager that brought some real stability in line with that. He took the club forward from being in a relegation battle to suddenly being on the verge of the playoffs last season. And then in the summer, you're thinking, okay, I'm not ashamed to say I backed Port Vale for promotion last summer, because I looked at the squad that they finished last season with, just outside the playoffs, set in playoff form, and they added 3 or 4 or 5 players to it without losing anything that they finished last season with. So it looked like a stronger squad on paper, and you're just thinking, right, this is could continuously just get better and better and better. But John Askey's track record is not necessarily, he still had to some convincing to do on that. He had one fantastic season with Macclesfield. You strip that aside, and okay, he made progress at Port Vale, but you weren't, he wasn't a certainty based on his track record to bring all of this together and to take them on a level. I think what it was that ambition became the thing all of a sudden at Vale, and I don't think that Askey could ever live up to them ambitions, and it became apparent towards the end in that run. You look at the reaction now under a caretaker manager, and you're just looking at that dressing room thinking, I'm not sure they were too inspired, and that was the problem, and that that Askey kind of just reached the end of the line in terms of his ability, I suppose, in terms of his experience, and he did a good job up to a point, but I think he reached his point and the end of the road for him.
Yeah, and they went from being one of the best defensive units in League Two to conceding some very, very sloppy and certainly goals that could have been avoided in the last few weeks. So Askey gone at Port Vale, and perhaps a more mysterious departure then, not necessarily down to poor form and poor form alone, but Joey Barton, a man we've already covered in one of our previous podcasts, he's gone at Fleetwood.
Yes, and yeah, I think what happens in League One, and I think this has happened in a few places, is that managers find themselves under pressure relative to what's happening elsewhere. In Joey Barton's case, he's had 3 years. This is his third season now at Fleetwood, and Andy Pilley, the chairman, has seen Michael Appleton come in at Lincoln and what he's done there in a short space of time. Relative to last season, I think Jack Ross went because Paul Lambert walked in. We'll talk about Paul Lambert later, but walked in at Ipswich. They had this blistering start over 10, 12 games, having just been relegated from the Championship. And it's like Sunderland were looking over the garden fence thinking, hang on, Lambert's just walked in and look what he's done already. We've been waiting 15 months for Jack Ross to do this for us. And I think there's a lot of that going on because it's so tight towards the top of the table in League One. I think owners and clubs are looking across at what everybody else is doing and what other managers are doing, and that's putting pressure on managers who aren't quite delivering over longer timescales. And I think that's what's happened to Joey Barton. But I think for his own part, it's interesting. I don't know if the Ched Evans thing's got anything to do with this. Has he got rid of an asset in Ched Evans for free, just carted him out the door kind of thing? That's come to the end of the road, and has that played a part in it, that maybe his handle on the dressing room was starting to go a little bit? That wasn't necessarily a great sign, but I think with Joey Barton, I think he landed on a winning formula towards the second half of last season. That was curtailed because of COVID. They didn't step up in the playoffs, and now this season's just looking like more of the same. And I think it's 2.5 years of the same thing. I think Andy Pilley will be looking and thinking, well, when are we going to get there? Because it doesn't look imminent right now. And I feel like I've given him a fair crack of the whip at this stage. And I think possibly just wants to feel a bit more excited about a new man in charge.
Yeah, it does seem to have unravelled fairly quickly. If you told Fleetwood fans that, 4 weeks ago, maybe they'd be without their manager and without one of their more potent strikers, they would, they certainly wouldn't have believed you. But now both gone at Highbury, and it remains to be seen who replaces Joey Barton. But two new arrivals, one in League One and a side right down at the bottom, and a man who's in fact, both of these managers that we're going to talk about, Mike, are returning to the club. Perhaps the most surprising return is Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank at Burton, and almost kind of written him off as a manager because we hadn't seen much of him recently, but here he is back in the English game, and he's got a heck of a job on his hands.
Yes, and I mean, I think the first point to make is that he did a fantastic job in his first stint at Burton. Wasn't so convincing at QPR, but potentially the dynamic was right. I don't think there's a lot of pressure at Burton, so I don't think it's one of those clubs that you would ever say, oh, it's dangerous to go back. You should never go back, because I don't think you're just going back to doing the job on your own terms. It's not like you come into these big expectations or massive media presence around you or anything like that. So I don't think that's necessarily an issue going back. So, he's worked with the chairman, Ben Robinson, before. He knows the club inside out. He showed signs, certainly at League One level in his first stint at Burton, that he could really knock a team into shape defensively. They're a very low XG team, very solid defensively in his first stint. Basically what he left behind was a real sort of robust outfit. So there's a lot of senior players there, and as long as the communication between Hasselbank and those senior pros who are basically, you need to get on side and you need to find a system and way of playing that's within their capabilities at their age. If that kind of synergy happens quickly, I think Burton have got enough. At the start of the season, you would never have placed Burton as relegation fodder, even though Nigel Clough had gone. So I think they can get out of trouble with Hasselbank, providing that initial synergy between a group of senior pros and a manager that's kind of proven at the level in his early days. I don't see why they can't get out of trouble from him.
Yeah, and they are scoring goals as well, Burton. It's just keeping teams out at the back. So if he can sort that out, if he can sort that area of the pitch out and tighten them up, then I've no doubt they'll start moving up a few positions in the near future. And finally, the other returnee, Mike, and this is perhaps less surprising because this one was touted for a good couple of days before the announcement. Paul Hurst back in at Grimsby, replacing Ian Holloway.
Yes, it seems sensible enough. He's basically, I think with Grimsby, you've always got to be aware of the fact that, it's a remote location. So if you've got a manager that's been there before and knows exactly what he's walking into and knows the area as soon as and the logistics of attracting players to the area and things like that. I think Hurst knows all these intangibles that somebody who's never worked for Grimsby or understands the club would know. He's proven at League One level. He is now probably a League Two manager, given his last job was a very difficult one down the road at Scunthorpe in League Two. This is kind of the level that he's plateaued at, so he needs to try and go again if he wants to get back up to League One. So it seems like a good fit on that level too. I think he's a solid manager after what happened with Ian Holloway and the broken promises and I think Holloway was trying to sell a vision of the type of club he wanted Grimsby to become in non-COVID conditions. That was never really going to happen. It transpired, and Holloway's gone now. So I think they just need to get back to being a stable club. And I think I think he can be quite a combustible manager, Paul Hurst. I think he can be quite fiery, but if people do what he says, basically, I think they'll become a very stable club as long as players start dancing to his tune and the way he calls the shots that he get in reaction that he wants.
Yeah, so loads of new managers coming in, and with all the sackings as well, I'm sure next week's podcast will have a few more new arrivals to discuss as well. So we'll go through some of those in 7 days' time. But let's get on to today's main subject, and that is a man who we have obviously not covered yet, but we've compared many managers to him already, including Darrell Clarke of Walsall, you mentioned last week, or a couple of weeks ago, Mike. Today's subject is Chris Wilder at Sheffield United. Of course, has done brilliant things at the club after several years in the Football League with Oxford and Northampton. Was also at Halifax as well at the start of his career. But this season, not going quite so well. We are in January and the Blades are yet to win in the Premier League. But a victory yesterday in the FA Cup. Chris Wilder, Mike, has been saying for some time, a win, any win, will just kickstart our season. We'll just get the ball rolling. And this may just do the job for them.
Yeah, I hope so, because I think it would be a sad... I think if things are to continue the way they've gone so far in the Premier League this season, no matter how much goodwill Chris Wilder's got at the club, and no matter how much the fans are currently behind him, I think if it continues the way it's gone in the first half of the season, I think his departure becomes inevitable. And that I don't want to see that. I think I'd like to think there's another chapter to this story, but it has been it's been a fantastic story up to this point. So it wouldn't be a surprise if it is coming to its own end. So at least now they've got that win, and the next few weeks are going to be interesting because, like Wilder says, it was never going to come from him, the turnaround. I think that's the issue with Chris Wilder. I think that the players needed to find something within themselves because that's his managerial style. It's all about mental strength and self-motivation. So he needed this because I think the reason why the season has escalated the way it has is because Wilder has been missing something that the players have needed. He's not been giving the players something of what they've needed. I think I think it was inevitable that they would struggle to live up to the standards they set last season. But things can escalate out of proportion eventually. And there comes a point where it's because of something that they're not getting behind the scenes. It's not just reversion to the mean of a high standard, an unrealistic standard that you set last year. You also reach a point where if a manager's skill set is right, he can step in and can change the direction of something. But there's two sides to every coin of every manager. And whatever is a manager's strength is also his weakness. And I think that's what's happened with Sheffield United this season. We've reached a point where Chris Wilder's strength has become his weakness because they kind of topped out of what they could have ever possibly dreamed of achieving under him.
There's so much goodwill, though, towards him, not just in the game generally, but amongst the Sheffield United fan base. If you just have a look at the general consensus, and I always have to caveat this with, I am only looking at social media and Twitter, so this is not a complete reflection of the fan base. But having spoken to a few Blades fans recently as well, they just love Chris Wilder, understandably, for what he's done. And it's unusual, isn't it, Mike, to see a fan base who are almost willing to forget what's happening now and just say, no, he's ours. He's sticking around. We want him here, despite what's going on the pitch. And I guess helped obviously by being a fan of the club, but it's certainly good to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, it's very, very rare. But as Wilder says himself in recent interviews, there's a backstory to this. You arrive in the Premier League and people think that that's just the beginning of a story. And in many ways, it's kind of the end of a story. It's the end of a cycle for Wilder. And I'd love the second half of the season to be more optimistic, like a new spring to emerge, that even if they go down to the Championship, okay, now it's the second cycle, we're all together. And I don't think for any moment Chris Wilder will be forced out by Sheffield United fans, certainly not. By the owners, even, I wouldn't expect them to, given where they've come from and where they are now. But I do think if it continues the way it is, it will reach a point where Wilder will become so frustrated that I don't think he'd be able to tolerate such an ongoing level of failure himself. And he would not necessarily, I don't think he's a quitter. I don't think he wanted it to come across that way. I just think his own exit will become inevitable through talks behind the scenes where it's not like, I give up, my whole man's up, I've taken this as far as I can. But it just becomes a kind of mutual consent type thing. That's my fear. And I really hope that the second half of the season proves a lot more promising. But the motivation is going to have to come from the players. They're going to have to find something themselves for Wilder in order for this story to continue and have another chapter.
Because they've not been losing games heavily, or certainly not many of them. A lot of 1-0 defeats. The problem has been putting the ball in the back of the net and converting chances. They've been in games, they've just been edged out so often. And that's hugely frustrating as a football manager and as a fan, of course, as well. Often when it gets to this point, Mike, you'd expect certainly by now the media to be carting out phrases such as dead man walking or, the inevitable sacking of. But we haven't seen too much of that so far. And although he is clearly a bit downtrodden by the situation, Wilder hasn't quite, for me, reached that inevitable stage where you see a manager and you look at him in a post-match interview and you say, that's them gone. They can't continue. He hasn't, for me, he doesn't seem to have quite reached that point, and certainly not now he's got that FA Cup victory under his belt.
Yeah, no, not at all. I think I think this is kind of feeding into the problem a little bit, though. I think what Sheffield United are lacking this season is something emotional. And I think if Wilder came under pressure, that kind of pressure, then the players have got something emotional to buy into, to just be on the right side of those fine margins and not be feeling sorry for themselves and not be lacking confidence that they're lacking. But the issue is, from Wilder's perspective, he's turned around and even said this himself. It's not my job to motivate the players. If you can't motivate yourself for playing in the Premier League, then I give up. I give, and that's his attitude towards it, which is natural for his personality type. This is the flip side of the mental toughness. You've got to be a certain, like we said about Darryl Clark a few weeks ago, you've got to be a certain type of character to be able to survive in a Chris Wilder environment. It's extremely masculine. You hold it together, you stay tough, and but there comes a point a loss of confidence is a loss of confidence, and it doesn't matter how mentally tough you are. This is what happens to a mentally tough team that's completely devoid of confidence. They never get beat 4-0. They just get beat 1-0 every week. And I think if you can find something emotional, this is sometimes where I think, it can come into the realm of assistant managers or outsourcing, bringing in a psychologist or something that just with a different perspective. It's Chris Wilder's very consistent in what he does, and so there's nothing, there's no real alteration, I imagine, to the mood behind the scenes. So it's like the players, as mentally tough as they are just festering in this mood of lost confidence and why is something going wrong, and nothing's really happening to change it. So this is kind of this is what they've got to get round in the coming weeks.
So what else do we know about Chris Wilder's personality type? Obviously, we know the mental toughness. We know that he demands a lot from his players. And we know that he's pretty much able to work with what he's got as well. And he's definitely improved players over the years. What else do we know about him?
Basically, we see how comfortable he is now in a relegation battle. We saw how comfortable he was being towards the top of the table last season. He's an adrenaline junkie, and he's very, very comfortable with high stakes football. It doesn't matter how high the stakes get. He's as composed as anything, and we're seeing that in his post-match interviews. He's totally unruffled, really unruffled. And that can, that is basically what has enabled Sheffield United to jump 2 divisions. Why they've gone from League One to the Premier League and not just plateaued in the Championship is that they're led by this leader who is, doesn't shy away from anything. The size of the challenge is never a problem. The bigger the challenge, the better. And he's not shying away from this relegation battle. It's probably the biggest, hardest battle he's faced, and he won't shy away from it. That certainly won't be the issue. And I think if the Blades can get a foothold in the season and can just get a little bit of momentum going, I don't know. There's a long way back to be turning around and saying that they can come back, but they can certainly take it to the wire and make it interesting between now and the end of the season, because I think, they can feed off any growing confidence. It won't be like, okay, we've turned it around a little bit and the dotted line's too far still. No challenge is too big for Wilder. So by definition, no challenge is too big for his players. But while they're in the rut and the loss of confidence, this is where we're seeing the flip side of that.
What's he like when it comes to versatility then? Because we know that he is widely credited with the overlapping the overlapping central defenders, which we've seen time and time again. And it's been a joy to watch, particularly at Championship level. It was effective in their first season in the Premier League. But in terms of ripping it up and starting again, is he likely to do that, or is he more of a manager who will just make a couple of tweaks here and there but largely stick to the same parameters?
I think he can be spontaneous. Whether it's ripping it all up and starting again is a different matter. But yeah, I think basically he's very adaptable in the moment. I'm not sure necessarily we go back to Darryl Clark saying about not settling one system is a problem for Clark, and you need some degree of continuity. But with Sheffield United, it kind of feels like we've gone past the continuity stage now, and it's like it's a new cycle. So possibly a revamp and a new system or a new something. But within that, he can be very adaptable and spontaneous. So if a game calls for something in a certain moment, he'll raise the stakes with substitutions. If a game needs chasing, he'll chase it. If it's a tight and tense 0-0 with 10 to go, he's perfectly comfortable with that and happy to know when to stick or twist kind of thing. I think he's good at making these real world decisions in the moment. But yeah, from a tactical perspective, I'm not really sure what it requires. Obviously, the injuries in the centre back positions have really affected them, and the 3-5-2 that served them so well. That's obviously a dynamic that's changed somewhat now. So I'm not really sure what the answer is from a logical perspective, but I do think that Wilder, he's not stubborn. He's not someone that's going to stick to his guns and no, we stick with it. We stick with this with a 3-5-2 because I think he can be adaptable. Absolutely.
He's improved a lot of players along the way, along the journey. And, he's also taken on a few players who have been troublesome or had their problems both on and off the pitch previously. What is it that he does then to get the best out of players who maybe could be described as a little bit nomadic previously, and those who are maybe just sort of threatening to go off the rails? He does have a habit of bringing them back round. Is that all about the mental toughness, Mike? Is that all about just getting them in the right place in their head, or is there anything else that he sort of conjures with?
Yeah, possibly. I think he's a sensationalist. I think if a player's got ability, he will tell them. He will big them up about the ability that they've got and what they're capable of doing. But the mindset is up to them. They either fall into his way of mindset. So some players, he's known for high player turnover and big turnover in transfer windows, and this is possibly a concern as well. Now is that he's finally found his group. A group that's big enough that everybody buys into the Chris Wilder dynamic and that the mentality and what he expects of his players every day. Now he's found that group, but we don't often get to see a manager, Chris Wilder or other managers of his type, stay with the same players for a continued length of time and how that plays out over a longer time scale. So that's also a slight concern now, is that some managers can be so intense and so, so sort of emotionally unwielding. They're just so kind of, they expect certain standards every day that it becomes draining over time. You've heard everything that a manager's got to say. You know exactly what the reaction's going to be in any scenario. And that element of surprise, that element of, the novelty factor kind of gradually fades. And then it becomes harder for the players to get the reactions out of his squad that he wants. That it's kind of, they're having to self-motivate emotionally themselves, but also they've kind of heard that everything that Wilder's got to say. And as much as they respect him, if they're lacking that newness and that fresh input, that's potentially another factor as well. So the January transfer window might be relevant in that sense as well, is can they somehow freshen it up in the window and find some new players who are going to be inspired by the type of manager that Chris Wilder is, rather than, relying on players that have pretty much heard everything he's got to say.
And what's he like on a day-to-day basis? And I'm going to double up this question and say, what's he like if you need an arm around the shoulder? To me, he feels like he's more of a kind of sergeant major approach with it. Let's come on, we can do this. We're fighting. We're in this together. Younger players sometimes are accused of being a little bit sensitive. How does he deal with those kind of situations?
Yeah, I think this goes similar to the motivational piece. He doesn't, he says it over and over again. I go back to an interview possibly 3 seasons ago when they just arrived in the Championship and they're trying to get used to Championship level football. And they were struggling in certain games. And he turned around in an interview. He said, people say put an arm around. He says, I'm not putting an arm around this lot. He said, they get well paid. They're playing it. They've got a dream job, and that's his sense of perspective. There's only one sense of perspective he's got, and it's you're lucky, be grateful. Now man up and get out there. And he'll say it over and over again. It's the same thing as what he was saying a few weeks ago. As if I have to motivate these players for the Premier League, then I give up, because if you can't motivate yourself for the Premier League, when can you? And it's the same again. I'm not putting an arm around this lot. My uncle works in a factory. Why should I put an arm around this lot? They've got nothing to worry about. And that's it. You don't get that from Chris Wilder. But then if you do get that, you don't get the mental toughness in the beginning in the first place. It's two sides of the same coin, and now we're seeing the other side of that coin.
Yeah, maybe he needs to extend his arms around the whole squad over the next couple of weeks and get them up the Premier League table. Finally, before we move on, Mike, and we'll be talking about Paul Lambert in just a minute or two, I think we've mentioned Darrell Clarke enough so far. 5 times I think he's been mentioned already in the opening 30 minutes, which is more than I think he was on his actual podcast. But who else would you compare Chris Wilder to then, who's currently managing or has been managing previously in the Football League?
Not necessarily in terms of managerial style. I think there's similarities with Neil Warnock in the sense that when Warnock was at Sheffield United, I always thought Warnock was a manager, would be at Sheffield United for life, because he's a Sheffield United fan. He's got the same flow state and driver function, very adrenaline based and, very in the moment. And, I always thought that and I'm now, because of the way this season's panning out, you thought Chris Wilder was Sheffield United for life. And I'm now, beginning to think maybe the next chapter for Sheffield United and for Chris Wilder might be elsewhere, and it seems unthinkable, and it's probably, Sheffield United fans will be shuddering at the thought of this. But I think if this season was to continue the way that the first half went, I think that would become inevitable, because I think Chris Wilder stops becoming Chris Wilder if things go stale, if it gets boring and monotonous, and the day-to-day gets the same and the players have lost confidence. I just don't think you're seeing the real Chris Wilder anymore, and I think his next chapter might have to be somewhere new. But we're talking about one of the most influential managers of certainly the past 5 years. I think what he's done has been absolutely off the wall incredible, and it's just right now we're looking at Sheffield United in this context and Chris Wilder in this new context that we've not seen before. And he's had so much unparalleled success for so long that, it's an intriguing dynamic of which way it's going to go. But yeah, I think Neil Warnock's possibly, you think of Neil Warnock, how many different clubs he's had, yet what such a fantastic manager he still is. At each club he goes to, he completely, just changes the whole culture and dynamic of the club, mentally strong, and all of these things. And I think Wilder, the job he's done at Sheffield United, he could potentially do similar jobs elsewhere again and again at different clubs. But I just wonder now at Sheffield United, it'd be interesting to see. This is why this weekend and this win at Bristol Rovers is such a pivotal moment. It could be a sliding doors moment in terms of where it goes for Wilder and Sheffield United. I'd love to see Sheffield United under Chris Wilder for the next 5 years, but I've got my doubts now.
Before we move on to speak about Paul Lambert, Mike, just a quick word about Foxpunter being a busy few weeks, and looks like it will continue to be so throughout January.
Yeah, I'm working on some interesting material at the moment as well in terms of discipline and mindset in a betting context, because it's something that I've always had feedback from subscribers over the years. How do we improve my discipline? And I see it's a big issue that people want to work with, want to know more about. So that's kind of, I'm working on a project at the moment. I'll have more news in the next few weeks, but there's going to be, things going on basically that, people can get involved with for free, but it's going to be like how to develop your best possible mindset as a punter, without falling into the usual traps of things that get you, not gambling responsibly, basically.
Excellent stuff. And you can find us on social media as well. It's at Foxpunter on Twitter or on Facebook, and we're on Instagram as well. And you can check out all of the podcasts that we've done, all up to episode 11 so far, which is today's, on our YouTube page as well. And I also, Mike, enjoyed the feature on you by We Love Betting last week as well, in which you talked about your victory in 2013 with Bradford securing promotion, and you spent the rest of the summer at the beach. If you want to check that out, head to our Twitter page. You can find it on there. Alternatively, We Love Betting have got an interview with Mike on there as well for you to enjoy. Right, let's move on to a man who probably wishes he could be on the beach, but at the moment he's actually fighting a bit of a battle at Portman Road. It is Paul Lambert, a man who came in, kind of cheered up the fan base, Mike, I think, didn't he? Doom and gloom. At first it all looked pretty rosy, but now it's kind of just going a little bit sour. And yesterday's loss to Swindon, a side who were placed 23rd in the table, was particularly harrowing for some supporters.
Yes, and yeah, I mean, it's the latest in a long line of tenures for Lambert that have been very underwhelming. And then you kind of look at his track record as a whole now, and those two back-to-back promotions at Norwich are very much the outlier in terms of, the storyline of his entire career at this stage. And yeah, he sold promises at the beginning of this tenure at Ipswich, and he's and the last two seasons are kind of along a similar theme. He's kind of flattered to deceive by starting the season very well, by making big deals in the summer and kind of building up his team's chances, only to then play them down when things start going wrong. And his perspective quickly changes in a way that fans really don't want to hear. And yeah, it's proven to be another very underwhelming tenure.
The only word that I said this to you in a WhatsApp message last night, the only word that I can kind of associate with Paul Lambert, for me personally, is dour. He just doesn't really offer anything. And I personally can't imagine being inspired by him, but he must have something, because he did really pick those players up at the start of his time at Ipswich.
Yes, he's got experience, and I think managers of his type, basically experience is a big thing. And he's got. We've talked about Lee Bowyer, for example, in the past. Being a centre midfielder, played 500-600 games at the very highest level. There's not many scenarios he hasn't seen within a game tactically. Now, I don't think that Lambert's very cunning tactically necessarily. He's more of an emotional type manager, but he's played at the very top level, and he knows what dressing rooms are like. He's won a Champions League, as he mentions quite regularly, and usually in a defensive sense, when a result hasn't gone well or a performance hasn't been good, he'll pull this out. I've seen it all before. I'm not worried about getting the sack. I'm not worried about this, that, and the other. And he falls back on his experience all the time. But yeah, I think you're right. I just struggle to find a defining. I profile managers. I profile him, and my job is to find defining features that and I really struggle with Paul Lambert to find anything specific that, he's fantastic at that, and he displays it really well. Because, like you say, whatever he does behind the scenes, he's quite dour in the media anyway. So it's not like he gives anything away of what his actual secrets are. So I really struggle with him to know what it is that he brings. I just know that he reacts more than he takes control of things in advance. But in recent jobs, that tends to be reacting to some form of crisis or things going wrong and trying to manage expectations rather than manage what's actually happening on the pitch. That's what we're seeing most often.
Are there any other managers then that you have struggled as much to profile? I'm imagining all your documents here, Mike, on your computer, and I'm imagining the Paul Lambert one just says Paul Lambert at the top, and you've not got any further. I might be wrong, but are there any others who are equally as tough? Do you think you don't give much away?
There has been a few, but no, I think Lambert tops the list. I think he's my go-to of a manager that you really struggle to nail down and think, right, where would I use Paul Lambert as an example? If he was doing leadership coaching, for example, and finding someone of a personality type and saying, okay, here's an example, here's a role model for you to someone. I'm struggling to think in what context I would use anything of Paul Lambert to show someone as a demonstration. Now, that might just be a media thing. That might just be Paul Lambert being the sort of manager that keeps his cards close to his chest. And the players obviously must see something more than we see on the outside. But, there's not even small threads of things that you think, okay, I'll follow that line of thinking, plot this to performance data or plot this to past results or anecdotal things that I've seen in the past. I really struggle to see, other than the fact that he's a real football man that's seen it all before and has possibly an anecdote for every situation he finds himself in. He can immediately relate something to a player from his own past experiences, and that may be comforting to players. But in terms of, a project of what he's building over time or a team that he puts on a pitch with an identity, I don't really see it with him. I just don't. So on that level, I struggle with him.
Yeah, we talked about Chris Wilder, of course, in the first half of the podcast. And sometimes you might see a team and you'd say, that's definitely a Chris Wilder team. Maybe from a negative point of view as well, but you might say that's a Tony Pulis team, or, that's a Jose Mourinho team. You'd look at the, Pep as well. Loads of managers you'd look at and you'd go, that's definitely their blueprint. They've definitely had an effect on that side. There's nothing about that Ipswich lineup, and I was looking at the lineup and I was looking at the way they've set up over the past sort of 40 games. There's nothing really that I see that's kind of any different from any other previous Ipswich managers.
And identity's been an ongoing theme throughout, tactical identity, because when he came into the club, he talked about wanting to 4-3-3 was his way of playing, and he wanted to create this 4-3-3 system. He basically wooed the Ipswich fans at the beginning, not with results. It was you look back to that season when they went down from the Championship, that wasn't good enough from Lambert as a whole in the end. But what he managed to do in the second half of the season without getting too many results was woo the fans with some nice football that opposition were probably quite happy for Ipswich to play because they didn't pose much of a threat. But they looked tidy on the ball, and they kind of went down with a feel-good factor that something was happening, that, you know, there was this exciting football that we could look forward to in League One. They bought players that were, you know, they had players that were supposedly too good for League One when they started that first campaign. They got off to a flyer, top of the table after 11, 12 matches, sort of October, November international break, looking like they're just going to wipe the floor with the division and go straight back up. Then it all fell apart, and he's just been managing expectations since. Yet somehow, I mean, we talk about defining features. Negotiation might be one, because how he managed to wangle a 5-year contract last Christmas on the back of like an 8 or 10 game they were losing and drawing games. They'd not won for 8 or 10 games or something, and he managed to turn what was a short-term deal into a 5-year contract. And now, you know, people are questioning his integrity and stuff like that because he won't walk away, because why would you walk away sat on that 5-year contract? But, you know, he's strengthened his position, and it was kind of almost a position in the summer where Ipswich fans were in a position, in a predicament where it's like, well, he's on this 5-year contract. We kind of got to back him now, haven't we? Because, you know, it's going to be expensive to get rid of him. So, and that's he's, you know, and I don't think, you know, you can't discredit a manager for negotiating himself a 5-year contract, but it's added to the problems that have followed. So Lambert can't really turn around and say, well, a lot of these problems aren't of my own making, because most of them are. He's been in the job for 2 years now. And, you know, we're still talking about not seeing an identity on the pitch of a Paul Lambert team. Still the same conversation of should it be 4-3-3, or should an Ipswich team always have 2 strikers on the pitch? The midfield needs to be closer to the attack. And these are conversations I was hearing 12 months ago, and it's still the same conversations happening now. So where's the progress? You know, and this is the problem.
Yeah, we both listened to a bit of the post-match chat on BBC Radio Suffolk, and there were fans on there who were very disheartened, very upset with the lack of effort from their players. One of them did say that James Norwood came on and completely changed the way that Ipswich played, but also some of them pointing the fingers at Marcus Evans as well. Does he have any responsibility in this? Because he hired Lambert, and he knew about his track record, and he knew about his Norwich connections as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with Evans, I think there's been a theme with his managerial appointments down the years that I think Ipswich fans are, you know, he's completely at odds with the culture of the Ipswich fans. What Marcus Evans wants and what Ipswich fans want are 2 entirely different things. And Marcus Evans is trying to accommodate them, but not accommodating them. He's got his last 3-4 months since Mick McCarthy. You know, he went for a very, very similar manager in Paul Hurst in terms of the football that the fans were going to expect. I don't think the fans for a moment really bought the Paul Hurst appointment because they wanted more expressive attacking type football. I think, you know, it was mentioned in the Radio Suffolk chat yesterday that, you know, Ipswich fans see themselves as generally a mid-table club, playing nice, expansive football, you know, and maybe selling on a quality player from time to time. But if we're going to settle for mid-table championship, then we want the product on the pitch to be worth going to watch. We want to see some excitement from time to time, and, you know, a team that gets the ball down and plays. So, you know, basically, he didn't meet the Franz criteria in that sense when he went from Mick McCarthy to Paul Hurst. And then when he went from Paul Hurst to Paul Lambert, he thought he was getting a more, I don't know, a manager. He's basically gone from, he thought he was daring to go from Mick McCarthy to non-track record. He thought the imagination was in Paul Hurst never having managed at the Championship, but he had a solid track record lower down, and that's the only thing that Evans was buying into was the track record. He didn't bring the expansive football either. But then he went back to the higher level track record with Paul Lambert, and it's all about track record where Marcus Evans is concerned. But imagination doesn't necessarily come from track record. And we're talking about Paul Lambert, a manager. Again, we can go back to millennials and Gen X players. Well, Paul Lambert's success was with the past generation. He's had virtually zero success with the modern day player who, you know, the personal development type, individualistic, you know, players looking to further their careers, development type players. You know, a lot. He's so it's become a club that's embroiled in an owner at the very top who wants track record, who's very scared to take risks, doesn't spend, he's quite frugal with his money, but also wants to know that his manager is not going to do anything reckless and too ambitious. And that's what his last 3 appointments have been like. And basically, he's been presumably persuaded too much by a manager face-to-face with a track record in Paul Lambert than the thousands of fans who were all giving the feedback of what they want. He's managed to be persuaded by Paul Lambert in the first instance that his track record will still stand up going forward, what he's done in the past. And he'd had some disappointing tenures at Blackburn, Aston Villa, Stoke in recent years. Yet he's managed to persuade Evans in an interview on his track record. And then he's managed to persuade him into a 5-year contract when things aren't going well. So he's clearly vulnerable in this interview negotiation scenario with someone who's got a solid track record, can kind of sell him a vision, but the vision that the fans want, they're getting nothing like. So there'll be some managers that are going with a vision, no track record to back it up, who might suit the Ipswich fans. And this is the dilemma, when Lambert did go from Ipswich, the next appointment, I wouldn't necessarily expect anything different. I just expect more of the same, and it come down to track record, because he's not the kind of owner that will buy a vision, who will understand exactly what it is that the fans want and find the right manager for that vision.
Yeah, a lot of disenchanted fans in Suffolk at the moment, and we hope for their sake that either Paul Lambert can start to turn them into a winning side, or maybe the next appointment is, against all odds, an inspired Lambert at Ipswich and Chris Wilder at Sheffield United profile today. We'll do 2 more, of course, next week. Before we go, Mike, is there anything else you'd like to touch on? Any other business that caught your eye this weekend?
No, not particularly, because it's a really difficult weekend, FA Cup 3rd round weekend, because you're not getting the normal interviews out of managers. It's mostly about the changes that made. Why did they make the changes? There's not much continuity. You throw in all the postponements of late, and these questions about, whether teams are fit or rusty or, fresh, or it's so much up in the air at the moment. It's really difficult to find, anything that's personality based, because all managers are basically reacting to the conditions at the moment.
Okay, we'll rename that section No Other Business then, I think, for now. Mike, we'll be back next week with 2 more managers. Once again, thank you very much for your insights. Really interesting stuff on both Wilder and Lambert. And if you want to take a look at the Foxpunter social media channels, it's at Foxpunter on Twitter. Mike, you tend to put quotes from managers as well. You see midweek as well in between podcasts. So definitely worth a look, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll be always keeping abreast over anything that's said in interviews.
Absolutely. And Mike is going to write a few words on his Paul Lambert spreadsheet, I think, as well, now that we've discussed him. So we're back in 7 days' time. Thank you very much, Mike.
Yeah, pleasure, Jack. Thanks again.
And we'll do it all again next week.